It should have never come to this, Madam Speaker. Had the government properly consulted with Canadians, this expansion of MAiD would have never seen the light of day. Instead, what we now have is MAiD in Canada, triumph of ideology over common sense. The Liberal government's recent decision to further delay, but not cancel, the expansion of MAiD to the mentally ill reflects an unserious approach to this all-important life and death issue. MAiD was originally designed for those whose physical illness was incurable and caused intolerable pain, and where death was reasonably foreseeable. But the Liberals soon eliminated the requirement that death be reasonably foreseeable, and then went far beyond that by quickly agreeing to a demand from the unelected Senate to expand assisted suicide to include those suffering from mental illness. And the government has signaled a willingness to go even further by including children in their deadly scheme. As we had predicted back in 2016, when the Prime Minister introduced medically assisted death to Canadians, our country is now hurtling down a steep and slippery slope. And despite accusations of fear-mongering and exaggerating leveled at us, history has proved our Conservative MPs were right. Over 8 short years, our country has moved from banning assisted suicide to having the most permissive and dangerous regime in the world. The statistics are staggering. Last year, over 13,000 Canadian deaths were attributable to MAiD, a 31% increase over the year before. And that's without MAiD being made available for mental illness. MAiD is now the 4th leading cause of death in the country. When compared to other jurisdictions where MAiD is available, like California, Canada's assisted suicide deaths far exceed those of other jurisdictions. That should really concern us, as it reflects a reckless implementation of MAiD. And imagine how many more thousands of deaths will be added every single year should the Liberal plan to include the mentally disordered come into force. Of increasing concern are the growing number of cases in which MAiD has been improperly approved and administered outside of what the criminal law currently allows. Here are just a few of them, Madam Speaker. There's a Hamilton man who would rather die than struggle with poverty. That was reported in the Hamilton Spectator Reporter. The Cape Breton woman who sought MAiD over lengthy workers' compensation delays. The Ontario quadriplegic mother who applied for MAiD over lack of access to disability supports. The former Paralympian who told MPs that the Veterans Affairs Department offered her assisted death instead of help. The Winnipeg woman who chose to die through MAiD because of her futile struggle for home care. And then there's the case of Donna Duncan from my own city of Abbotsford, who was euthanized because mental health support wasn't available when she needed it the most. Indeed, she received MAiD without her daughters Christy and Alicia knowing about it until after the fact. No chance to say goodbye to their mother. Then there's Catherine Mentler, who lives with chronic depression and suicidality. Feeling particularly vulnerable, she went to Vancouver General Hospital, looking for psychiatric help for feelings of hopelessness she couldn't shake. But instead, a clinician told her there would be a long wait to see a psychiatrist and that the healthcare system is broken. And that was followed by a jarring question. Have you considered MAiD? Can you believe it? And then there's Sophia, who suffered from severe sensitivity to smoke and chemicals, triggering rashes, difficulty breathing, and blinding headaches. She died by MAiD after a frantic effort by friends, supporters, and even her doctors to get her safe and affordable housing in Toronto. She begged officials for assistance in finding a home away from the smoke and the chemicals wafting through her apartment. The government sees me as expendable trash, a complainer, a useless, and a pain in the ass. That's what she said, Madam Speaker, in a video filmed 8 days before her death. So, Madam Speaker, Canadians are dying unnecessarily and under circumstances that scream out for reconsideration of how far Canadians are prepared to go in euthanizing their fellow citizens. It's become stunningly clear how little this government consulted on MAiD expansion. Mental health professionals are only now becoming aware of the government's plans to euthanize persons suffering from mental disorders. Psychiatrists, psychologists, clinical counselors, suicide prevention experts, overwhelmingly, they oppose this expansion. And only recently has the government begun to consult with Indigenous communities, our fellow Canadians who are at greatest risk from an expansive application of MAiD. The provinces and territories, has already been mentioned, have sent a joint letter to the government that they're not ready for MAiD expansion. Indeed, they've called not just for a delay, but for an indefinite suspension of the government's plans. And ordinary Canadians, of course, have repeatedly said they do not favor expanding assisted suicide to include the mentally ill. What's worse, this expansion is taking place at a time when Canada faces compounding national crises in mental health, palliative care, opioid addiction, affordability, and homelessness. The skyrocketing cost of living has only exacerbated these profound social challenges. So the government's reckless approach to MAiD also flies in the face of Parliament's stated commitment to suicide prevention, including the recently activated 988 suicide helpline, thanks to my colleague from Cariboo, Prince George. How can you claim to support suicide prevention efforts when at the same time you're promoting state-facilitated suicide? Clearly, the government's contradictory approach has been one in which blind ideology has trumped common sense and reason. And more troubling is that the message to our most vulnerable Canadians, the mentally disordered, the opioid addicted, the homeless and hungry, the veterans, is that their government would rather euthanize them than provide them with mental health and social supports they need to live productive, meaningful lives. The utilitarian implications of this government's approach are deeply disturbing and profoundly wrong on so many levels. By any other definition, expanding MAiD to include the most vulnerable is nihilism hiding behind the fig leaf of compassion. In a briefing recently, Liberal government officials indicated that they are still hell-bent on expanding MAiD to the mentally ill. It's just that their masters, namely the Prime Minister and his Liberal colleagues across the floor, don't want to face the voters' wrath for placing their corrosive ideology above the interests and welfare of the most vulnerable among us. That's why they, the Liberals, have kicked the ball down the road to avoid the political consequences. Madam Speaker, we can and should do better. What is really required and what Canadians are demanding of the Prime Minister and his Justice Minister is that they put a full stop to this madness now. There being no national consensus on MAiD expansion, completely rescinding this policy is the only reasonable and responsible thing to do. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Lac St. Louis. Madam Speaker, I appreciate
on this third edition of the Special Joint Committee together. I know the member is a lawyer, and my question is really a legal one. Does he expect that this, and I agree with the recommendation of the committee for an indefinite delay, but does he expect that this case will come up at the courts, at the Supreme Court eventually, I guess, and what does he think the reasoning of the court might be, given that the definition of irremediability in law is very different from irremediability in clinical medical practice, which requires a little bit more certainty, and there's a tension there between the two. So I'd be interested in his perspective on that.
For Abbotsford.
Well, Madam Speaker, let me first of all thank this member for bringing such a thoughtful approach to our work at the committee and now here in the House. I agree with them that we should have an indefinite pause on this expansion. But with respect to the Supreme Court of Canada, I think it would be wrong to presume what the court might read into any additional changes that might happen. We do know that the federal government refused to appeal lower court decisions like the EF decision in Alberta and the Truchon case in Quebec to the Supreme Court of Canada, which is where this type of final decision should rest. And I expect fully that eventually a case will make its way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, where the Supreme Court of Canada will opine whether the Carter decision should go beyond just the incurable, intolerable illnesses where death was reasonably foreseeable and should in fact include vulnerable populations like the mentally ill.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments. The honourable member from Montcalm. Madam Speaker, my colleague is complaining that some people say that he is spreading fears and he's not able to use technical terms that are adequate to debate. The Association of Canadian Academies doesn't talk about children. Talking about children in general is lacking intellectual rigor in a debate like this one. We're talking about immature individuals. There was a gentleman who had cancer that was eating his bones. He was an athlete. He had a really strong heart, but he suffered for 2 years, Madam Speaker, because he wasn't eligible for MAiD. He asked for it, and he died at the age of 17 years and 10 months without MAiD by suffering in total fear. And what did we give him? Palliative sedation at the end of the day, because we weren't able to calm his suffering. And what did palliative sedation do? Well, they saw this individual in delirium for 24 hours before dying. And is that what my colleague is talking about?
Well, Madam Speaker, I'm deeply disturbed that this individual would actually promote assisted death for children. And don't forget, Madam Speaker, the suggestion is not only that this would be assisted death for mature minors. There's a suggestion that parents wouldn't have the final say over whether their children are euthanized. This is appalling. Is this the state of our country, where we have parties in this House of Commons that are actually promoting the death of children, when in fact they can be helped, they can be treated? Madam Speaker, we can do better as a country. I know we can.
We have time for a brief question. The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think my colleague shares my concern that we're now 30-some days away from an arbitrary deadline that was imposed. You know, we passed a national palliative care motion that I brought in 2016. Nothing was done. 2019, we brought the national suicide prevention strategy that was based on the work in Nunavut. Everybody signed off. Nothing was done. And now we're told that we should be making it easier for people who are suffering mental illness, people who are on the streets, people who have opioids, people who are hopeless, that we should be fast-tracking that rather than putting in place the protections to protect people. I want to ask my honourable colleague what his thoughts are.
A brief answer from the honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, I want to thank my colleague for that excellent question and for his work at the MAiD committee, where we did excellent work in coming up with a recommendation that unfortunately the government didn't choose to follow in its entirety. We had called for an indefinite pause. Unfortunately, the government felt 3 years, an arbitrary 3 years is sufficient. But to answer his question, I have great concern that this government's promises to deliver improved palliative care supports to the provinces, to deliver improved mental health supports to the provinces have not been fulfilled. And now people are asking for death because they're not getting those supports. That truly is sad.